Welcome back to the deep dive. It seems like everyone's buzzing about the 2024 election.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
And you guys have sent in some fascinating sources with, well, let's just say some very different predictions.
Oh, sounds intriguing.
We're talking Biden winning by a landslide versus Trump with a 99% chance of taking it all. It's like a political thriller. So are you ready to dive in and dissect these forecasts?
Absolutely. I'm always up for a good political puzzle.
Okay, so the first source is this research paper, and let me tell you, these researchers, they're not messing around. They went all out with the data crunching.
Curious data nerds.
Totally. They use this thing called a logistic regression model.
Okay, and remind me what that is again.
Well, it's basically a way to analyze how different factors, like the economy or demographics, might influence how people vote.
Right, makes sense. So they're using data to try and predict the future.
Exactly. But then they take it even further with this technique called multilevel regression with post-stratification. You got it. It's kind of like taking a small sample of voters and then using that to create this big picture prediction.
Interesting. So what's their verdict? Who are they putting their money on?
Well, according to their model, Biden's looking at a pretty decisive victory.
Really? By how much?
They're predicting he'll snag 56.59% of the popular vote.
Whoa, that's a huge chunk.
Yeah, and it translates to a major win in the electoral college, too.
Like, how major are we talking?
Think 471 to 67.
Okay, now that's a landslide. Are they predicting any big surprises in terms of which states might flip?
Oh, absolutely. They've even got these colorful maps and charts showing how states like Texas and Florida, those Republican strongholds, could actually flip to blue.
No way. That would be a political earthquake.
Right. It would totally shake up the political landscape.
Okay, but even the smartest models have their limits. What are some of the things they might have missed?
That's a great point. They admit that their model doesn't account for third-party candidates who, let's be honest, could really shake things up, especially in those close races.
True, those wild card candidates can always throw a wrench in the works.
Right. And they also acknowledge that their model is based on the assumption that past voting patterns will continue.
Which, in this crazy political climate, might not be the safest bet.
Exactly. So while their prediction is fascinating, we got to take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, so that's one model. What's the other source say?
All right, so now we've got 538's 2024 election forecast, and, well, they're painting a completely different picture.
Oh, how so?
They're giving Trump a whopping 99% chance of winning.
Whoa, hold on. That's a complete 180 from the first source.
Talk about a plot twist. And get this. They say Harris's chances actually shot up by 6 points in just one day.
One day. That's wild. It sounds like this election is way more unpredictable than anyone thought.
It's like trying to ride a bucking bronco. You never know which way it's going to go next. But 538 is really focusing on those key battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. You have the usual suspects.
Right. Those states always seem to hold the key to the White House. So how's 538 coming up with their prediction? Are they also using a fancy model?
They're taking a more, I guess you could say, holistic approach. They're combining polls with data about the economy, past voting trends, even demographics.
So they're trying to get a bigger picture view, not just relying on who's ahead in the polls at any given moment.
Exactly. They're looking at the whole political landscape.
Okay.
So on one hand, we've got this research paper saying Biden's heading for a landslide.
And on the other hand, 538 is practically handing Trump the victory.
Talk about a head scratcher. So how do we even begin to make sense of these wildly different predictions?
Well, that's where the real deep dive begins.
Right. We need to look under the hood and figure out why these two approaches are leading to such different outcomes. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each method? What are they getting right? And where might they be missing the mark?
It's like you're playing detective, trying to piece together the clues to solve this political mystery.
Exactly. So let's start by dissecting that research paper. What are they doing right? And what might they be overlooking?
Well, their focus on demographics and past voting behavior is a powerful tool, but it kind of assumes that history is going to repeat itself.
Right, like we're on autopilot.
Exactly. And in this election, with so much uncertainty and change swirling around, that might not be the safest bet.
So are they missing some crucial pieces of the puzzle by focusing so much on the past?
That's the million-dollar question.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to 538. What's their approach? And what should we be watching out for?
Well, they rely heavily on polls, which can be both super helpful and super tricky.
Oh, I know. Polls are like those magic 8 balls. Sometimes they get it right and sometimes they're way off.
Exactly. And remember what happened in 2016? Lots of polls predicted a Clinton victory, and, well, we all know how that turned out.
Don't remind me. That was a political earthquake.
Huh.
So is 538 making the same mistake by putting so much faith in polls?
They do acknowledge that polls can be fickle. That's why they try to balance them out by factoring in those other things we talked about, the economy, past voting patterns, demographics.
So they're trying to create this more stable prediction by taking a wider view. But what if those other factors, the economy, history, demographics, what if they're not as reliable as we think?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's like trying to navigate with an outdated map.
Okay, so we've got one model that's all about demographics and past behavior, and another that's trying to balance polls with a whole bunch of other factors. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, but they also leave us with a whole lot of unanswered questions.
That's what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're not just looking for simple answers. We're trying to understand this complex and ever-changing political landscape.
We're going to take a quick call.
Actually, before we jump ahead, let's zoom in on those battleground states and see how these different approaches play out in those crucial races. Stay tuned.
Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty and zoom in on those battleground states. The ones that always seem to decide the election.
Right, the nail-biters.
Exactly. Now, that first research paper, the one with the MRP model, they're predicting that Biden could win some traditionally red states, like Texas and Florida.
Whoa! That's a bold prediction.
I know, right? It almost sounds too good to be true for the Democrats.
Well, they're banking on those demographic changes, the increasing Latino population in those states. They're saying those voters could really shift the balance.
So they're thinking those changing demographics could create like a blue wave.
That's the idea. But, it's not just about who lives where.
Right. People are way more complicated than that.
Exactly. We've got to consider the economy, local issues, even the candidates themselves. All those things can sway voters.
It's like this giant puzzle with all these different pieces that fit together.
That's a great analogy. And that's where 538's model, the one that factors in polls and all those other variables, might give us a different perspective.
Oh, interesting. So what do they have to say about Texas and Florida?
Well, according to their model, those states are still leaning red, but the margins are much tighter than in previous elections.
So they're not ruling out a potential flip, but they're not as optimistic as the research paper.
Right. They're acknowledging those demographic shifts, but they're also saying, hey, there are other forces at play here.
Like what kind of forces?
Well, things like the current economic climate and the overall mood of the country. Those intangible factors that can really influence how people vote.
So it's like a tug of war between demographics on one side and all these other factors on the other.
Exactly. And it's really hard to predict which side is going to win.
Okay, so Texas and Florida are still up in the air. What about some of those other battleground states 538 is highlighting? Like what about Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania? Those states that were super close in 2016 and 2020.
Oh, yeah. Those are always nail-biters. And those are the states where we can really see the limitations of relying just on polls.
Oh, tell me about it. 2016 was a real wake-up call.
Right. The polls in those states really underestimated Trump's support. It was a big part of why that election was such a shocker.
So are you saying we shouldn't trust the polls at all?
Not necessarily. I mean, they can be helpful, but we have to remember they're just snapshots in time. People's opinions can change really quickly depending on what's happening in the news or even how the questions are worded.
So it's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. That's why 538 tries to combine polls with all those other factors, economic trends, historical voting patterns, to try and get a more complete picture.
So they're trying to avoid those polling surprises by taking a wider view. But what are they seeing in those key states? Are they leaning towards Trump, or is there still a path for Biden to win them back?
Well, their model shows those races as super tight.
Oh, more nail-biters.
I know, right? It's going to come down to things like voter turnout, which issues resonate in those specific states, maybe even some unexpected events.
So it sounds like a few thousand votes in a handful of states could decide the whole election.
It's definitely possible. And that's what makes these elections so fascinating. Every single vote really matters.
That's a powerful thought. Makes you realize how important it is to get out there and vote, especially in those battleground states where the margins are so small.
Absolutely. Your vote could be the one that tips the scales.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture. Now let's get into the specifics. What are these sources seeing in those battleground states that's leading them to their different conclusions?
Okay, well, let's start with the research paper's prediction of a Biden victory in Texas and Florida. They're putting a lot of emphasis on those demographic shifts, especially the growing Latino population.
Right, they're saying those voters are increasingly leaning toward the Democrats.
Exactly. They think that shift could be powerful enough to turn those traditionally red states blue.
So they're envisioning this potential blue wave sweeping through those states.
Right. But 538 isn't quite as convinced. They're also looking at the economy. They're saying if voters think the economy's doing well, it could benefit the incumbent party, even in states where the demographics are changing.
So it's kind of a battle between demographics and the economy.
You got it. And each source is weighing those factors differently.
Interesting. What about those other battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania? What are they saying about those races?
Well, in those states, both sources are highlighting the importance of voter turnout, and they're also talking about the potential for third-party candidates to play a spoiler role.
Oh, right. Those wild cards can really shake things up.
Exactly. The research paper even admitted that they didn't factor in third-party candidates, which could definitely impact the outcome, especially in close races.
So it's like another layer of uncertainty on top of everything else.
Pretty much. That's why it's important to go beyond just looking at the top-line numbers and really dig into the details of each race. That's where we can find those little clues that help us understand what's really going on.
So we've got these shifting demographics, economic anxiety, and the potential for third-party candidates to throw a wrench in the whole thing. It sounds like we're headed for an election that's going to be close, contentious, and probably keep us all glued to our screens on election night.
You've got that right. But with all this uncertainty swirling around, are there any factors that these sources might be overlooking, any hidden currents that could influence the outcome in unexpected ways? Something for our listeners to think about.
That's a great question. One thing that immediately jumps out at me is the role of social media and the spread of misinformation. Neither source really delves into this, but it's a powerful force that could have a huge impact on how voters see the candidates and make their decisions.
That's an excellent point. We're seeing how social media can be used to amplify certain messages, even if they're not true. And it can create these echo chambers where people only see information that confirms their existing beliefs.
Right, and that can really influence how people vote, especially if they're getting their information from sources that aren't reliable.
Exactly. It adds a whole new level of complexity to this election.
It's almost like we need a whole separate deep dive just to unpack the role of social media in this whole thing.
I think that's a fantastic idea. But for now, let's circle back to the sources we have. Even though we can't say for sure who's going to win, are there any big takeaways from these forecasts? Anything people should keep in mind as this election unfolds?
Well, it seems like one thing's for sure, this election is going to be anything but predictable.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like trying to predict the weather weeks in advance. There are patterns and trends, but ultimately, who knows? It could be sunny, it could rain, it could even snow. So, out of all this, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away? Well, I think one thing that really jumps out from both of these sources is just how much the American electorate is changing. We're seeing this whole new generation of voters, and they're starting to reshape the political map. Even that prediction of Texas and Florida flipping blue, even if it doesn't happen this time, it really shows how much things are shifting.
Yeah, it's like we're not stuck in those old voting patterns anymore.
Exactly. Things are changing, and those changes are going to have a big impact for years to come.
So what else should our listeners keep in mind as they're watching all the election coverage? What are some things they should be looking out for?
Well, I think both forecasts really highlighted how tricky polls can be. They can be helpful, but they're not always accurate, and they can change really quickly. Remember 538's approach? They were really emphasizing the need to look beyond just the polls and consider all those other factors that might be at play.
So don't just get caught up in who's head in the polls at any given moment.
Right. It's about taking a more holistic view. Look at the bigger picture, the underlying trends, and be prepared for some surprises along the way.
Because there are always surprises, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. And both sources really underscored just how much uncertainty there is in this election. We're living in a time where things are changing so rapidly and unexpected events can happen at any time. Think about it. A global pandemic, a sudden economic downturn, even a major international incident. All of those things could completely change the course of the race.
It's kind of a humbling reminder that even with all our data and fancy models, we can't actually predict the future.
Nope. We can't. There are always those wild card factors, those things we just can't foresee that can throw everything off course.
So as much as we might want things to be predictable,
Right.
this election is probably going to be a nail-titer right up until the very end.
Yeah, get ready for a wild ride.
Now, before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, about how these sources might be overlooking some important factors. You mentioned the impact of social media and the spread of misinformation. Can you talk a bit more about that? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, social media has become such a dominant force in how people get their information, and unfortunately, a lot of that information isn't accurate or reliable. We're seeing how it can be used to spread misleading narratives, to create these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs, even if those beliefs aren't based in reality.
So it's not just about being misinformed, it's about being manipulated.
Exactly. And that can have a huge effect on how people vote, especially if they're basing their decisions on information that's distorted or just plain false.
It's almost like the whole political landscape is being warped by these invisible forces.
That's a great way to put it. And it can make it really hard to figure out what's true and what's not.
So what can people do about it? How can they protect themselves from being manipulated?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be critical of the information you come across online. Check your sources, be aware of the potential for bias, and don't just believe everything you read.
It's like being a detective, always questioning, always looking for evidence.
Exactly.
So as we head into this election season, it's more important than ever to be informed citizens, to think critically, and to make sure we're basing our decisions on facts, not on fear or propaganda.
Well said. In a world where we're bombarded with information, it's crucial to be discerning and to seek out reliable sources.
So let's all try to be a little more skeptical, a little more discerning, and a little more thoughtful as we navigate this election. It's about having those tough conversations, listening to different perspectives, and trying to understand the complexity of the issues.
I couldn't agree more. Ultimately, it's about participating in the process in a way that's thoughtful and informed, no matter who you're supporting.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the 2024 election. Hopefully this has given everyone some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to learn more about the issues that matter most to you.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll be back soon with more fascinating topics and deep dives. Until then, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep exploring the world around you.